The Great Chamber of the Galactic Council had witnessed countless debates, from trade disputes to territorial squabbles, but never had its walls carried a silence so sharp. The report pulsed across the chamber's central display. A coalition of outer rim species had launched a strike on Earth. For a moment, there was only disbelief. Counselors shifted uneasily in their seats, their bioluminescent eyes blinking in patterns of confusion, mandibles twitching, frills stiffening, tails curling. Some thought the transmission must have been mistranslated, others assumed it was a cruel joke. The idea of attacking humanity seemed absurd, like striking a nest of venomous predators and expecting no consequence. The presiding arbiter called for order, but the chamber rippled with agitated voices. One delegate scoffed openly, reminding the hall that humanity was still a relative newcomer, a species that had clawed its way into space within the span of a few galactic centuries. Others muttered that humans were reckless, undisciplined, fragile creatures whose bodies withered under hostile conditions that many species endured with ease. Their critics framed them as dangerous but ultimately contained, a young race with too much fire and too little patience. Yet beneath the veneer of dismissive laughter lay a strain of unease. Every species present carried ancestral memory of what humanity had already survived. One elder delegate spoke in a low, careful tone, recalling the classified records from first contact. Those files described humanity's brutal history in unflinching detail: centuries of internecine wars, weapons of mass extinction, entire cities reduced to ash by fire and steel long before they reached orbit. These were creatures that had stared annihilation in the face repeatedly and emerged hardened, relentless, and inventive. The Council had locked those records away for fear that young species might emulate the humans rather than fear them. Yet now those files became the only measure by which to judge what might come next. Another counselor, scales glittering with disdain, dismissed such warnings as ancient paranoia. He insisted that technology had rendered humans obsolete. Their fleets were small, their colonies few, their armaments crude by galactic standards. Surely the coalition striking Earth would overwhelm them within days, perhaps hours. His words were punctuated by nods from allies who believed that numbers alone determined victory. But even as they spoke, a subtle tension began to spread through the chamber. Every seasoned diplomat understood that wars were rarely decided by raw numbers when humanity was involved. History proved again and again that these primates transformed desperation into strategy, chaos into opportunity. Whispers swelled, remembering the Battle of Cygna Prime, where a human expeditionary force, hopelessly outnumbered, had turned a collapsing moon into a kinetic barrage that shattered an enemy fleet. Another voice recalled the Mars terraforming crisis, when humans under siege rerouted atmospheric processors to suffocate their attackers while sealing themselves underground for months until the skies cleared. These stories were supposed to be cautionary legends, reminders not to push too far. And now, before their very eyes, a reckless coalition had done precisely that. The arbiter's gavel reverberated, demanding clarity. A courier drone streamed battlefield projections into the chamber. Alien ships massed along Earth's periphery, confident, arrogant, advancing without subtlety. To the untrained eye, it looked like a swift victory in progress. To the veterans who understood human nature, it looked like the prelude to a nightmare. One delegate muttered what others dared not voice. "They have awakened the predators." The phrase spread like a chill through the hall. For no matter how sophisticated the galaxy considered itself, everyone remembered that humanity's greatest weapon was never its ships or guns. It was the will to survive at any cost. The chamber divided into factions. Some urged immediate intervention to restrain the coalition before the situation spiraled into a catastrophe. Others hesitated, unwilling to risk involvement or admit their fear. A few even entertained the possibility that humanity might finally be broken, that the legend of their resilience was just that, a legend. Yet deep down, beneath the noise of debate, a shared realization took root. If humanity survived the first blow, they would not simply defend. They would retaliate with the fury of a species that had buried billions of its own yet continued to thrive. And if that fury turned outward, no border would hold, no law would restrain them, no coalition would remain safe. When the session adjourned, the councilors left in uneasy silence. The question lingered in every mind, unspoken yet heavy as stone: what kind of madness would drive anyone to attack Earth, knowing the consequences? The answer, they suspected, would soon be carved into history in fire and blood. The first strike against Earth was meant to break its spirit, yet it had the opposite effect. Within hours of the assault being confirmed, governments that had bickered for decades moved as one. Old grudges dissolved under the weight of survival. Leaders who had once stared each other down across battle lines now spoke in hurried unison, their voices carrying the same vow: Earth would not fall. The instinct for unity came not from lofty ideals but from something far older, something buried in the marrow of the species. When threatened with extinction, humanity never fragmented, it sharpened. Civilian networks became command relays. Retired engineers were pulled back into service, their experience suddenly priceless. Satellites long forgotten in graveyard orbits were jolted awake, patched with improvised code and redirected into defensive nets. On factory floors, machines designed for cars, aircraft, and consumer goods were stripped and recalibrated to churn out weapons, armor, and drones. Even museums found their stockpiles emptied as relics of past wars were repurposed. Humanity had never discarded its history of violence. It had only shelved it, and now every lesson returned. The population did not wait for instructions. Across continents, civilians organized themselves with startling efficiency. Students converted laboratories into research hubs for medical supplies and battlefield diagnostics. Farmers created logistical pipelines to move food into cities bracing for siege. Programmers working from dim apartments cracked into alien transmissions, dissecting their protocols with relentless curiosity. Every mind was conscripted, every pair of hands redirected toward a singular purpose: survival. In that moment, humanity revealed its greatest strength was not its armies, but its ability to mobilize the entire species into a machine of war. Military response was immediate and ruthless in its precision. Fleets scattered across the solar system pivoted in formation, moving to intercept at choke points calculated down to the second. Orbital platforms once designed for exploration reconfigured their payloads for defense. Experimental railguns, still in testing, were rushed into deployment with no time for perfection. What could not be tested would be proven in fire. Generals spoke not of defense, but of how best to bleed the invaders before humanity's counterblow. Losses were expected, sacrifices certain, but surrender was absent from every plan. Beneath the mobilization lay a deeper current of emotion. Fear ran through every household, but it was a fear tempered into determination rather than paralysis. Families prepared for blackouts and bombardments with the same stoicism once shown in world wars. Communities set up underground shelters not only for survival but as command centers to keep communication alive if cities above were reduced to rubble. Children were taught not to hide but to carry supplies, to watch over the wounded, to memorize evacuation paths. Humanity was not shielding its young from the war, it was preparing them to endure it. Alien observers misinterpreted the frenzy as panic, failing to recognize the rhythm behind the apparent chaos. Where outsiders saw disorganized activity, in reality, a network was forming at breathtaking speed. Humanity thrived on improvisation, on turning shortages into advantages. The coalition attacking them had calculated firepower, fleet size, and technological superiority, but they had not accounted for a race that had survived plagues, famines, collapses, and wars of annihilation by constantly adapting. Every setback only fueled invention, every loss became data, every wound a lesson sharpened into the next strike. Whispers from the Council's informants reported astonishment at how quickly Earth adapted. Whole nations shifted to war footing in days, something other civilizations took centuries to achieve. Factories were already producing new ship components faster than projections allowed. Prototype weapons, barely sketched out in laboratories, were entering combat trials. Humanity's weakness, its constant state of conflict, was proving to be its greatest strength. Where others enjoyed centuries of peace, humans had never stopped preparing for catastrophe. When catastrophe came, they welcomed it like an old adversary. As fleets moved into position and the first countermeasures launched, the message became clear. Earth had been struck, but Earth would not collapse. It would gather its strength, unify its billions, and unleash a storm the galaxy had not witnessed in generations. The coalition had mistaken resilience for fragility, patience for passivity. In their arrogance, they had triggered the one response they could never control, the relentless awakening of humanity's collective will. The first engagement unfolded far from Earth, in the cold expanse of the outer system, where the coalition believed they would shatter human defenses before any true resistance could form. Their ships advanced with formation drills perfected over millennia, confident in numbers, certain of superiority. They expected terrified retreat or reckless charges. What they met instead was a storm of calculation. Humanity had studied their movements the moment the invasion fleet crossed the threshold of the solar system. Every orbit, every trajectory, every timing window had been mapped by minds conditioned to turn scarcity into precision. What the coalition saw as a clumsy defense was, in truth, a trap already closing. As the alien vanguard reached the Kuiper Belt, they encountered mines hidden among the drifting rocks, crude in appearance yet devastating in effect. Salvaged ice fragments laced with explosives detonated with such ferocity that entire squadrons were torn apart before they realized they had entered a kill zone. Asteroid clusters shifted under controlled bursts from human thrusters, redirecting massive projectiles along paths impossible to predict. To the coalition, it looked like chaos. To humanity, it was choreography born of desperation and genius. Every ship humanity fielded was outclassed individually, yet none fought alone. Small craft darted between larger vessels, relaying fire and feeding real-time data into shared networks. Human crews burned themselves to exhaustion, running constant calculations to exploit every weakness, every hesitation. When alien jammers attempted to sever communications, humans adapted, transmitting through laser pulses bounced off asteroids, through coded bursts carried on civilian probes repurposed as relays. Redundancy layered over redundancy until cutting the network became impossible. The invaders found themselves fighting not isolated ships but a swarm linked by willpower and ingenuity. Losses were severe. Human vessels cracked apart under barrages, crews swallowed by fire, but none fell in silence. Each doomed ship spent its last moments inflicting maximum damage, colliding with enemy hulls, overloading reactors, venting atmosphere into plasma bursts that engulfed attackers. No retreat orders were given, because every captain understood instinctively that survival depended on buying time with blood and steel. Alien strategists who had expected a clean extermination began to falter, bewildered by a species that treated annihilation not as defeat but as opportunity. The coalition's commanders attempted to tighten formation, believing discipline would restore control, but the maneuver played directly into human hands. Narrow corridors of approach became funnels for concentrated railgun fire. Converted mining platforms spat tungsten slugs at velocities that shredded shields never designed for such blunt force. Automated drones, little more than welded scrap with thrusters, accelerated into kamikaze arcs that gutted carriers. Even as alien ships outgunned their opponents tenfold, they found themselves bleeding momentum, losing vessels faster than calculations predicted. Observers from the Council, watching from secure relays, could hardly believe what they witnessed. The invaders were supposed to crush Earth's defenses like a child breaking glass. Instead, their fleet staggered, their advance slowed to a crawl, their losses mounting against enemies that by every metric should have folded instantly. More chilling still was the sight of human adaptability in real time, tactics shifting minute by minute, weapons modified mid-battle, strategies rewritten as if the chaos itself was their chosen battlefield. For every human ship that was torn apart, 2 more learned from its fall. Mistakes became lessons, lessons became counters, and counters became victories measured in wreckage scattered across the void. By the time the coalition managed to break through the belt and press inward, they had lost more vessels than any had projected possible. What they dismissed as a primitive resistance had revealed itself as a relentless grinder, willing to consume flesh and metal alike until the invaders drowned in attrition. When the battle's aftermath rippled across the stars, one truth echoed louder than the wreckage fields: humanity did not fight to preserve the present. They fought to ensure the enemy remembered the cost of underestimation. What was meant to be a swift demonstration of dominance became the first chapter of a war the galaxy would never forget, and the Coalition realized too late they had set loose a predator that could not be caged. The Coalition believed that breaching the outer defenses meant the war was theirs, but humanity had only begun to fight. Losses in the Kuiper Belt ignited something that no invader could quantify. Resolve sharpened into fury. Earth's response shifted from desperate defense to calculated retaliation. Factories operated without pause, cities pulsed with production, and research labs unleashed decades of forbidden theories that had been shelved for fear of their consequences. Now nothing was off limits. Every weapon humanity had ever imagined, every nightmare concept once deemed too dangerous, was given form and hurled into the void. Orbital yards produced projectiles so massive they did not require explosives. Kinetic rods of tungsten, dropped from orbit at near-relativistic speed, turned alien carriers into molten debris with impacts that no shield could resist. Communication grids once designed for global networks were transformed into weapons of disruption, hacking into coalition systems, scrambling targeting arrays, and rerouting commands until ships fired upon each other in confusion. Engineers who once wrote code for peaceful exploration retooled their skills to infiltrate enemy firewalls, implanting viruses that converted advanced guidance programs into blind chaos. On the ground, humanity's resilience turned into ingenuity without restraint. Launch sites hidden in deserts and mountains released swarms of drones, each no larger than a bird, but programmed with ruthless precision. They infiltrated hull breaches, attached themselves to reactor cores, and detonated in synchronized waves that crippled ships far larger than themselves. What the invaders dismissed as primitive toys became swarms of metallic locusts, carving through fleets that had never faced war at this scale. Alien commanders attempted to regroup, but every formation they assembled was disrupted before it stabilized. Humans exploited gravitational wells, slinging vessels around planets and moons to appear where no enemy predicted. Old satellites were reborn as electromagnetic weapons, pulsing bursts that stripped shields bare for minutes at a time. Civilian freighters, painted to look harmless, concealed rail cannons that shredded unsuspecting attackers before vanishing into asteroid fields. Every tactic reeked of improvisation, yet each strike revealed preparation deeper than anyone imagined. The Coalition's numerical advantage began to erode under the sheer unpredictability of the campaign. Their advanced doctrines had been honed through centuries of controlled warfare, but they were designed to counter opponents who thought like them. Humanity did not. Where most species clung to tradition, humans thrived on innovation born from desperation. Each encounter was different from the last, each strike adjusted to exploit new weaknesses. No algorithm could model them, no projection could contain them. In the language of the Council's strategists, Earth had become an outlier, a variable immune to prediction. Reports filtering back to the Council carried tones of disbelief bordering on fear. Invader fleets meant to intimidate were arriving home in fragments, if they arrived at all. Captains who had sworn swift conquest spoke instead of relentless pursuit, of enemies who fought as though death itself was only another weapon in their arsenal. Even the most dismissive counselors fell silent as they realized the humans were no longer merely resisting. They were hunting. Human leadership no longer debated survival, it debated escalation. Voices once restrained by caution now argued openly that deterrence required demonstration. The Coalition had struck Earth, and that wound demanded more than defense. It demanded retribution that would echo across the stars. Plans for strikes beyond the solar system took form. Engines that had waited in testing bays roared into readiness, preparing to deliver not just protection but vengeance. Humanity's fleets, scarred and bloodied, were becoming something new, predators that had tasted the enemy's weakness and were unwilling to let it go. The invaders had believed they were teaching a primitive world its place. Instead, they had awakened a species that turned every scar into sharpened steel, every loss into fuel for invention, every memory of pain into a weapon. Humanity was no longer reacting, it was advancing. The question was no longer whether Earth would endure, but how far its wrath would reach once unleashed. The war reached its turning point when the Coalition realized the battle was no longer for Earth's survival but for their own. Humanity had carried the fight beyond the edges of the solar system, striking at supply lines, ambushing reinforcements, dismantling outposts that had once seemed untouchable. Each counteroffensive pushed deeper into enemy territory, leaving behind fields of wreckage that glowed like scars across the void. For every world that had cheered the coalition strike, silence replaced arrogance, because word traveled faster than fleets. The humans were coming. Coalition leaders pleaded for unity, but their fractured alliance unraveled under pressure. Accusations spread among them, each blaming another for underestimating the Terrans. Some attempted to negotiate quietly, sending envoys to parley, but by then humanity's rage had taken form. The message Earth transmitted was short and unyielding: you came to exterminate us. You will learn what it means to be hunted. Diplomacy had ended the moment the first human cities burned. Now only consequences remained. Human fleets, once ragtag assemblies of retrofitted vessels, transformed into engines of devastation. Shipyards that had been civilian hubs of commerce became fortresses producing warships at speeds that defied precedent. Every new design was leaner, deadlier, built from lessons paid for in blood. Stealth vessels infiltrated deep behind enemy lines, disabling infrastructure and broadcasting signals that sowed panic across entire systems. Orbital bombardments fell on strategic installations with such precision that even planets untouched by fire felt the terror of vulnerability. For the first time in living memory, the aggressors of the galaxy faced a war they could not contain. The council chambers grew silent as casualty reports arrived. Species that had once boasted of their fleets now begged for protection, though they had been the same voices that mocked Earth's fragility. Delegates who once demanded humanity's restraint now spoke in whispers, warning that to corner such a species was to invite destruction without limit. They no longer debated whether the attack had been wise. They debated whether the galaxy itself would survive the fury they had unleashed. Among the coalition worlds, fear spread faster than human weapons. Colonists abandoned frontier stations, merchants ceased trade, and soldiers deserted fleets that returned home gutted by battles no one had predicted. Entire civilizations reoriented their priorities from conquest to defense, scrambling to shield themselves from the vengeance that marched ever closer. Yet no shield held for long. Humans exploited weaknesses with relentless precision, tearing through defenses that had stood for centuries. Each collapse deepened the legend of their inevitability. Then came the first captured broadcasts from human fleets, chilling in their simplicity. They did not gloat, they did not taunt. Their message carried only one warning: we did not choose this war, but we will end it on our terms. That phrase, repeated across frequencies, shook every listener, because it carried no hint of compromise. It was not a threat, it was a statement of fact. For a species that had already proven willing to pay any price, such a declaration meant annihilation for those who stood in their path. The final blow was not a single battle but a cascade of defeats. Coalition strongholds fell one after another, their defenders broken by a relentless advance that allowed no time to recover. Humanity did not pause once momentum shifted. They pressed forward with the inevitability of a rising tide. By the time the last invader fleet disintegrated under sustained fire, the coalition no longer existed as a coherent force. What had begun as an act of arrogance ended in dissolution, shattered by the will of a people who refused to be broken. When the smoke cleared and the reports reached the council, the chambers sat in silence darker than any in its history. Delegates understood the truth that no one wished to speak aloud. Attacking Earth had not been reckless, it had been suicidal. The humans had not merely defended their home, they had carved a place in the galactic order through terror and unyielding strength. From that moment forward, every world would remember the lesson carved into the stars, that to strike at humanity was to gamble with existence itself.